if you have a place like Sweden, Finland, the Nordic countries that push gender equality, they actually have a lower proportion of women going into these STEM fields than a country like Saudi Arabia, which isn't well known for its gender equal beliefs.
There was that discrepancy that the people that I saw as affected the least by the so-called patriarchy were the ones that I was only hearing this argument from.
People just aren't doing what they want them to do, and so now they have to force people to fit into their preconceived notions of things. So there are actual preferences outside of being harassed by the gender equality czar or whatever. What it says is that the evolved traits that give one sex or the other the advantage, the full expression of those traits is very dependent on health, current conditions, and developmental conditions.
You started one of your articles that you wrote for Quillette with this sentence: boys and girls are not infinitely malleable, socially constructed products of the patriarchy. Why do you think the culture still pushes this narrative despite decades of research proving that that narrative is simply wrong?
Right. Well, I think a lot of people, especially in academia, want to believe that human behavior is highly malleable or modifiable by social construction, social rules, or whatever the case might be, because in that way they can mold the population to behave in ways that they think is most appropriate. I think a lot of it comes from some women who are very competitive and compete with guys in the broader cultural domain and want to think that there's really no differences between men and women. And so the finding that there's more men going into engineering, for example, has to be a social construct due to, beliefs, stereotypes, bias, or whatever the case might be. It can't be due to, well, there actually are differences between boys and girls and men and women. And some of those differences push boys and men in one direction and girls and women in another direction. And if that's the case, they can't rearrange society to reflect their preferences.
Not perfectly anyway, or not as far as they might sort of want to push it.
Right.
So do we actually know whether part of our nature is actually sort of driven by the society or the cultures that we are raised in? And do we actually know roughly what sort of percentage of our drivers is down to evolutionary biology and the way that we've evolved, mm-hmm. and what percentage, if you like, is actually due to the environment which we were raised in?
Right. Great question. We don't really know the percentages, and certainly there are really important cultural, social influences on behavior, including sex differences in behavior. I think a lot of those social rules either amplify or suppress the expression of evolved biases, or they keep them in check or make them larger than they otherwise would. I don't think they're actually creating a lot of the behavioral differences between men and women. They're minimizing or exaggerating them, depending on the culture, context, and a variety of other things.
So the drivers are still there, but just by the fact that we are a social creature and we have to obey by the rules of the community that we find ourselves in,
right.
We have to sort of keep them at bay, if you like. Is that correct?
Right. Pretty much. So one example is rough and tumble play. So, wrestling, horsing around, pushing one another, stuff like that. Boys engage in it 3 to 6 more times more frequently than girls. And it's a way of it's play fighting. And in other species, it is kind of practice and refinement of actual physical competitive skills that will emerge in adolescence. Now, some cultures where most of the males don't actually fight in wars and so forth, the rough and tumble play, the boys' socialization of it is kind of camped down. It's kind of, let's not do that. Let's not get out of hand. And you can't get rid of it completely, but you can suppress it. In societies where there's a lot of male-on-male violence, intergroup warfare, and so forth, in adulthood, the adults of the society actually amplify rough and tumble play. They make it more aggressive, more painful, and so forth. So they're making more aggressive guys than they would otherwise get, which they need in that context. In other societies where you don't need a lot of warrior males, they're suppressing it. So they're making the guys less aggressive, but you still get the sex difference in either case. It's just smaller or bigger.
Would it be then safe to assume that in the societies that do suppress, for example, that rough and tumble play, I think Western societies are a perfect example of that in education, where boys are not allowed to really run around and just be feral boys anymore, especially in school.
Right.
Would it then be safe to assume that we then see almost some side effects of the fact that we are suppressing the natural expression of certain traits?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to completely suppress those traits in boys. I mean, you don't want them to be roughhousing in the middle of a lecture, but on the playground, maybe a little bit of that is fine. That's the way boys develop relationships. They tend to have larger groups of friends than girls, and they kind of all go around together. And that roughhousing and stuff is really part of their social development. And if you suppress it, you're really taking away how boys develop relationships with other guys.
That particular subject is really interesting to me for very selfish reasons. I've got a toddler he will be 3 in a couple of months' time. And the one thing that I can sort of say about young boys is they are very physical beings.
Yes.
Like, if he is not tired enough, he can be a little absolute horror. But then if you actually just let them play and like roughhousing, he loves that.
Yeah.
Absolutely loves it.
Right.
He's not bothered about teddies at all. All he's bothered about is throwing things to the dismay of my partner, because he basically destroyed our TV already. Throwing things, anything with the wheels, and roughhousing. So any sort of type roughhousing. And he comes alive. He comes alive. So, and that started probably about 6 months when we really noticed anything with the wheels that he sees, he wants to play with.
Right.
So it then sort of really makes me laugh when I read these articles, saying that it's all social construct and the way that we raise them, because I think if you've got 2 different, for example, children from different sexes, or even one, you can usually tell that it's just not like that at all.
No, it's not. And a lot of it's been shown to be related to either prenatal hormone exposure or early postnatal hormone exposure. There are spikes in testosterone for guys in the first 6 months, and there's fluctuations of estradiol for girls in the first 6 months, and those have additional changes. The interest in little toy cars with wheels, things that move, kind of a non-biological motion, is a huge sex difference. That's one of the biggest differences there are in terms of play activities. Yeah, boys are physically more active. They really enjoy the rough and tumble play. That's how they bond with things. It's usually a really good time for them. And, they need space to run around, and throwing it, as you said, is another thing that boys do a lot more than girls. And they're pretty good at it, actually.
Yeah. I can tell.
Yeah.
Like I said, he just destroyed our TV completely. Just with one throw. So,
yeah,
in a way, it was like, yeah, don't do that. But I'm quite impressed with the speed that you've managed to chuck that cone.
Yeah.
But anyway, so how do then these differences start to manifest when it comes to the career choices that men and women naturally pick? Because, again, very much like with the culture, especially in Western countries, almost every single country has got a minister for equality, and it's usually like gender equality in workplace and all that. So what do we know about the actual choices that men and women make in their careers?
Yeah. So there are actual preferences outside of being harassed by the gender equality czar or whatever. So the biggest differences there, and they're well established, they go back decades, and they're found across cultures and across historical time within cultures, is that women prefer occupations that involve dealing with people or living things, like a biologist or vet, for example. And guys, on average, prefer occupations that involve dealing with things like computers or engineering, something like that, more inorganic types of things. Those are very, very consistent findings. We see, you mentioned that with your son, things with wheels, that's an object preference. And that's very common in boys, and leads to preferences, or is related to preferences in careers that involve, anything from mechanic to engineer to physicist or whatever the case might be.
Okay, so when we are then looking at these societies that decide to try and tinker with it, and actually sort of go for the equality when it comes to, for example, representation in, air traffic control, that's one of the things that there is a huge sex difference in terms of the people that are actually employed in these roles. Is it more to do with interest, or is it more to do with skill? So I'm trying to sort of get whether we are interested in different things, or whether we are interested and more skilled at them.
Yeah, it's probably both interest and skills. So the guy's preference for objects, how things are made, how they're put together, how they work mechanically, and so forth. There's an interest there in terms of, like what your son finds interesting. But there's also sex differences in mechanical reasoning, where boys have advantages in that they understand tools, construction, how things work more easily than girls do. And on the people side of things, girls and women are better at reading facial expressions, nonverbal cues, making inferences about what the person's thinking or feeling or whatever, which would be a great skill if you're a teacher or physician or nurse or whatever occupation you like. So the interest and skills tend to go together.
And then what then happened in the Nordic countries? Because I believe that the initial research was done in Scandinavia in general, because those were the most egalitarian countries, or the countries that did the most really to try and encourage the gender equality in career choices. What did the research find in those countries?
You're right. The Nordic countries have kind of pushed the ideology of everybody's the same and all outcomes should be equal and so forth to the extreme. relative to other countries. Paradoxically, what they got was, as the societies became richer, more kind of open, gender equal, and so forth, there was actually an increase in occupational segregation. So you had even more women in teaching and nursing or whatever, and even more men in blue-collar mechanical fields or engineering or related fields. So it was just the opposite of what they predicted.
When was all this research done? Because I'm assuming that was done before the gender equality czars, like you mentioned before, properly moved in with their incentives, because we know now in Western countries, certainly in the States and in the UK, it's definitely happening when they've got quotas for certain jobs. So they are actively discriminating against men in certain positions because they want to get more women in.
Right.
Now, that would be skewing the research.
Right.
But I think that is relatively new phenomena, perhaps because they've realized that our behavior isn't quite behaving according to their politically correct stances or beliefs.
Right. People just aren't doing what they want them to do. And so now they have to force people to fit into their preconceived notions of things. The early research on sex differences and things like occupational interests actually goes back 1930s or earlier than that. I mean, it has quite a long history. The work that I'm aware of that looks at the people-things difference in particular is like 1960, early 60s or so 60 years or so. So this has been known for a long time, and it's been replicated many times in many different countries. It's a very robust finding. In fact, Heesbert Stowett and I, who we did the gender equality paradox study together, did another one a couple of years ago looking at adolescents' occupational preferences. So what asked, I forget exactly how many kids are in this, but like 1.5 million or so across 80 countries. And there, the women or the adolescent girls were more interested in people-oriented occupations, and the boys in thing-oriented occupations. There was also a lot of boys and girls who were interested in occupation like manager. That's not clearly in either category. So white-collar occupations. But that sex difference is still there in adolescence. And if we look back at the earliest studies that we could find, those were conducted in like 1914, 1920 or so over 100 years ago. And the same sex differences. The big difference is the options available to women increased dramatically. So in 1914, you wanted to work with people, you become a teacher or a nurse. Now in 2024, you can become a teacher or a nurse, and a lot of people do. But we also have a lot more women in medicine. I think more now in terms of enrollment. Veterinary medicine is, at least in North America, is 80% women now. So it's a female dominated. So there was changes in kind of level and types of occupations filled, but the basic interests didn't change.
So what you sort of touched upon there was the gender equality paradox, and you were studying it specifically in STEM, but now you sort of referred to similar trend being seen in occupation levels. So the trend that you first coined in STEM, let's start with what did you actually find in that research? Because STEM is one of those areas of study that there is quite a big push to level the playing field, what some people would call, I suppose.
Yeah. So STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. and actually includes a wide range of fields. And a lot of the activists who push for more girls in STEM are not being totally honest about the numbers of males and females in STEM fields. So STEM includes, for example, all of the life sciences, biology, even parts of psychology, and so forth. And there's more women in those areas than there are men right now. The issues arise when you look at inorganic fields, computer science, engineering, physics, so forth. Those types of fields that involve dealing with abstract things or objects. And there, it's about a 3-to-1 ratio of men to women, depending exactly on the field. And so one hypothesis that was offered decades ago by social constructivist types said that, well, as societies become more and more equal and accepting of women having whatever roles they want and men having whatever roles they want, the prediction was that the psychological and behavioral differences between men and women and boys and girls would become smaller and smaller and smaller, and eventually result in, more or less equal distribution across all sorts of occupational categories and, working versus homemaking and those types of things. Well, it didn't work out that way. We in our particular study that you're referring to, we looked at the academic strengths and weaknesses of a bunch of adolescents in different countries, whether they're good at math or science or reading. And we also looked at the proportion of women and men who were receiving college degrees in one of these inorganic STEM fields, like computer science, engineering, those types of things.
Mm-hmm.
And the most interesting thing we found was that the more gender equal, wealthy the society was, the fewer proportion of women who went into these fields. So if you have a place like Sweden, Finland, the Nordic countries that push gender equality, they actually have a lower proportion of women going into these STEM fields than a country like Saudi Arabia, which isn't well known for its gender equal beliefs.
That finding just couldn't be funnier.
Yeah. It's just the opposite of what was expected. If everything is a socially controlled, top-down type of thing, you should find the reverse of that. And this equality paradox has been found for a number of other things: personality, risk-taking, even height is in there. So it's not just what we found. It's a
height.
Yeah.
Okay.
As populations get healthier, people reach their full genetic potential, and guys get taller more quickly than women do, and so the sex differences in height actually increase.
That's fascinating. That it's not just the software, but it's also actually like our biology is influenced by that.
Yeah.
Do we know like the difference, or perhaps like percentage of difference when it comes to the height of men in these different societies? The societies where men are allowed to be who they are, mm-hmm. and perhaps the societies where they are being a little bit more suppressed. Like, do we know the average difference in height, for example?
Yeah. So, it has more to do with health and nutrition during development for height, not social types of things. But yeah, in societies where men are the tallest, women are also taller, but the sex difference is probably 6 inches, 11, 12 centimeters or so.
Wow.
Yeah, so it's a big difference.
Okay.
In societies where there's a lot of disease, a lot of health issues, poor nutrition, so forth, the differences between men and women may be very small. They may be the same height, or men may be just a few centimeters taller. So
when it comes to the equality, going back to it, there's a couple of ideas that I'm sort of thinking about, because there is a lot of talk still in the culture about the gender equality, and I'm starting to believe that I don't think that it can actually exist. Like, the true equality simply cannot exist, because if we are really aiming for true equality, which we should define maybe as equal opportunities to reach certain goal, would you agree with that?
Yep.
Or would we use a different definition?
Right. Yeah, I think equality of opportunity is a good thing, and having people having the opportunities to do whatever they choose to do, or whatever they're good at, or whatever that's one thing. But a lot of the activists are pushing for equality of outcomes, which is where you start to get quotas and assigning people to things. And those are two different things. Equality of opportunity will lead to inequality of outcomes.
I think my thinking is even going deeper, to the point where I don't think that we can reach, for example, the perfect level of equality of opportunity. And part of the really good example is boys in education. So we now know that boys that are growing up without a father figure at home are disproportionately affected by all sorts of malaise, psychological and then outcome related. So we also know that there is a lot of boys, especially in the Western world, that are growing up without fathers. Now, education, overwhelmingly female. So you've got all of your teachers that are female, and you've got all of these boys that would really, really benefit from having some male role models. Right. Now, to give these boys equal opportunity in education, technically, what we would need to design is design the system in which we force more men into teaching, but that goes against what men naturally tend to choose as a job. Now, how could we possibly achieve that? By increasing the status of the teaching? But then we would only need to do that for men, because if we increased it for both women and men that would be going into teaching, those differences would still be there. So it seems to me that you've got different axes of equal opportunity, and some of these axes just budge against each other, so you just can't. It's almost like we are picking where we want to be equal and accepting that that will still create disparate or, not quite equal opportunities. So it gives us freedom to pick what we want, but the environment around us isn't necessarily equal for our own strengths. Does that make sense?
Yeah. It's all a trade-off. If you get more of one thing, like trying to get more men into teaching, you get less men going into engineering or computer science or carpentry or whatever the case might be. The same thing with women. You get them to go into computer science, then you get fewer physicians or veterinary, medicine folks. And so the only way you get equality of outcomes is through force and manipulation, or quotas, as you said. And boys' problems in school aren't simply not having dads at home to kind of keep them in line and to keep them focused. Boys also have more problems with reading. Girls have advantages in language, which gives them advantages in learning to read and enjoyment of reading. Boys struggle with that. And that, in another study we did, that's one of the predictors of the enrollment in college differentials. The guys just aren't at college level reading skills the same way as girls. Guys also don't like school as much as girls, and that's been true for forever because they have to sit still and they have to listen to somebody talk to them, but they'd rather run around and roughhouse with their friends or explore the environment or whatever. So it's a much more difficult transition for boys to sit in a classroom and pay attention and all of that. So a combination of things really is creating the problem.
I like the idea of trade-offs because what you mentioned about just boys just in general, they don't really like the education and how it's, for example, currently structured.
Mm-hmm.
If we really, really wanted to give all boys and girls equal opportunities, we would literally need to have two different systems of education. And perhaps for boys, it would look something like way more physical activities, way more doing things, a little bit less sitting around, sort of just listening to, a voice of authority in the front of the room. Right. But then also Richard Reeves, from his book, I've learned that boys mature slower than girls. Right. And he, I believe, is still in America trying to sort of influence the education system to let the boys literally just start school a year behind girls, just simply to give the boys that little bit extra time to allow their brain to mature, because our brains mature at different speeds, which is, again, just fascinating, another layer. So the equal opportunity, I suppose, even in education, it just, the true perfect equal opportunity, just isn't possible in our system. But another thing that I'm thinking about, which I would almost love you to try and pick holes in it, because this is something that I'm thinking about, and it's a little bit controversial. Now, I haven't spoken about it yet, so it might not be like a fully baked idea. But one of these arguments which people use, especially in the red pill community, that we should have equal rights when it comes to rights to choose. So we are talking over here about essentially abortion, right? Currently, women in most Western countries have got some rights to abort the baby, right? Let's call it the right to choose. Without really making any moral argument, if we wanted to have true equality, we should give men right to choose as well. But I actually don't think that would lead to a particularly good outcome, simply because we know, for example, that men are more are higher in social sexuality than women are, and men can technically have two successful mating strategies. One is high number of children, low investment, and another one is essentially smaller number of children but high investment. But women don't have that choice. If they want to successfully pass their genes, they've really got only one option available. So I personally think that even though it creates a system which is unfairly giving women choices that men don't have, if we flipped it around, we would have small number of men that really, really take advantage of the system. And disproportionately, we would have huge amount of women that are affected and huge amount of children that are then negatively affected. So it feels to me like what you said before, we are trading off discriminating against one sex, because in our opinion, it sort of, the outcome is better. It's a little bit better for us to accept. But so can you see any issues with my thinking there? Like, am I making any mistakes?
Well, so by male choice, I'm not sure what you meant, male choice in terms of forcing an abortion. or in terms of just
kind of.
okay.
There is a guy called George, and he's got this blog called Tin Men, and he talks a lot about men's rights, essentially, and how the media isn't perhaps portraying the true reflection of who men are. And I don't think that he was actually referring to like forced abortion, but what he was definitely referring to is, for example, the having opportunity to sort of, not put the tick on of, yeah, I would be happy to be a father if our sexual, for example, encounter, but like ends up with the pregnancy. So I don't think that it would be forcing women to have an abortion. I don't know that anyone would make that argument, but it was more of that, yeah, if something happens, you're on your own, love, type of argument. And yeah, I mean, I just don't think that, I just don't see that, for example, as equal, simply because I think the outcome would be still quite disproportionately sort of not in favor of women. And I think this is what goes back to the argument that I just don't think that the true equality can happen, because we are different. So we will skew towards different pathologies that are, sex specific, I suppose.
Right. Yeah. So I think I understand. So men having the option of opting out of any parental responsibilities in a free choice society. And that's true. I mean, in Western societies, there used to be a lot more social mores for guys to take responsibility, get married or so forth, even if they weren't ready, if their girlfriend or whoever got pregnant. As we have released those mores and become more liberal and more kind of individualistically expressive, that's provided some guys the opportunity to have kids without taking any responsibility for them. And the moms, of course, are paying a disproportionate share of the, taking on all of the burden for that. I think it's personally irresponsible. And that's one of the trade-offs that you get with a really open liberal society. It's like, well, anything goes. Well, if anything goes, then that goes as well.
Yeah. I think it's just such a shame that the culture at large and media just isn't encouraging a more nuanced discussion, because these are complex things, and we've got in it like unintended consequences everywhere. But the narrative is still just very, very simple. It's our patriarchy. If you're struggling with anything, it's the guy's fault. And I started in a world of online businesses. So I am in a lot of communities with female online businesses, essentially, business owners. And there is still so much of that around, just that belief that it's all patriarchy, but it's not a lot of nuance, essentially. And I just think that both sexes are actually losing out because we're just, or the culture at large just isn't prepared to have these difficult discussions. At the end of the day, they are not easy, and I think your research has proven that.
Yeah, it's not easy. So these women you're talking about, is there anything that women do that's not the fault of the patriarchy or guys?
Not. There is a lot that is being blamed on it. So don't get me wrong, it's not all women, and I think there is a certain amount of like taking responsibility, but the overarching sort of sentiment, I can sense it. That's the first thing that I started noticing before I even went down the rabbit hole of starting to question a little bit more deeply certain narratives. Because I was seeing that there was a lot of women that were blaming men for a lot of things. And it's like, if there are any women that are not under the form of patriarchy, if such was to exist, those are the online business owners that really have got their own money, their own success. They are not dependent on their husbands, partners, or whatever. So there was that discrepancy that the people that I saw as affected the least by the so-called patriarchy were the ones that I was only hearing this argument from. That was the sort of the initial intellectual dissonance that I just couldn't get over.
So
why that was happening.
So what was happening to them that they were blaming men for if they had their own?
An example is, I'm not sure if you punish yourself with being on social media, but on LinkedIn, that was an exact example that they've given. That a guy reached out to them on LinkedIn and said something alongside the lines of, "Oh, you've got a great business, but I can see how I can improve it. Why don't you work with me? Here is how you can do that. We can jump on a call, blah, 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 and I'll make your business better." And she went on to this Facebook group complaining essentially that that's mansplaining and why in this world we are still having to live through that. And I actually jumped on that conversation. I said, to be fair, I get just as many of these pathetic messages from women as I do from men. So it's just a marketing strategy that was taught by someone. Nothing to do with mansplaining. So, but yeah, I suppose, if we tell constantly women that they are being oppressed, then they start to believe that they actually are, even though it might be completely innocent.
It has the effect.
Communication.
I think it has the broader effect of pushing guys away from relationships. The talk of the patriarchy, toxic masculinity, and just kind of attacking guys for who they are. Makes guys withdraw, or at least a lot of them, not want to take the risks and engage in relationships, which is why marriage rates are dropping.
Yeah, and I think we see that now, especially with the younger generations, when more and more young women are turning more liberal, sort of more leaning more towards the left, and more younger boys are either turning more towards the right or leaning right, or just completely checking out of the entire dating game. So there is another sex differences that I wanted to dive in, and it is in our cognitive abilities. What do we know as a sort of general overview?
So generally, girls and women do better on in areas that involve social relationships. So reading facial expressions, picking up on changes in vocal intonation. As I said previously, making inferences about other people's thoughts and feelings, picking up body language, and so forth. They generally are better at that. They have advantages in a number of language areas. So verbal fluency tends to be higher with women. So a lot of the social cognitive types of things they have advantages on. There are brain differences that go along with those advantages. So the language network is a little beefier in women than men, for example. Boys and men tend to do better on tasks that involve things like mechanical reasoning, as I mentioned previously, visual spatial abilities, imagining objects and being able to rotate them, navigation, kind of going from one place to another and then able to find your way back without a map or your your iPhone telling you which way to turn. So visual spatial mechanical sorts of things for guys, social cognitive types of things for girls, episodic memory for girls as well.
And those differences, because we know, for example, that we do then have more masculine girls and more feminine boys. Is that driven by hormones? Those changes in the temperament?
Probably driven, at least in part, by prenatal, early postnatal hormones. We don't fully know with all of them, but we know that girls who have higher than average levels of exposure to male hormones are kind of tomboyish when they are older. They like more rough and tumble play. They're less doll play. As they get older, they're more interested in male typical occupations and so forth.
And is that exposure to more testosterone or more androgens prenatally or postnatally? Do we know? In
that particular case, it's prenatal. But there are other studies that have looked at prenatal, early prenatal, late prenatal, early postnatal for 6 months or so, and they all have somewhat different types of effects.
Again, a little bit of the interest area of mine, because I am pregnant right now, and we don't know what we're having. Although I'm adamant it will be a girl, but I do take regular every single day cold showers or cold baths, so my testosterone is relatively high for a woman. So I will let you know in about a year's time whether, if I think that what we are having, we will be having, whether she will be tomboyish.
I don't know.
It's fascinating, that development. I don't think the cold baths will elevate the testosterone to that extent. What I was talking about is a. So is it like a really high sort of elevated testosterone due to some, I don't know, illness, for example, or some sort of malfunctioning? Is that the sort of differences that we would need to see those differences?
Right. In this case, yes, there's a genetic disorder that leads to increased production of male-like hormones. So those girls and boys get it too. Those kids are easy to identify at birth, and then they can be followed from then. What we don't know as much on is natural variation in prenatal and early postnatal exposure. And there's quite a bit of natural variation for both boys and girls. And there's some work on that suggests that, how much boys are exposed to testosterone prenatally, you get it from the amniotic fluid, will influence their boy typical behaviors, cognitions, and so forth later. At least it's correlated with it. But we don't fully understand the range of that and how other things might interact with it. And it's there, but how much?
Do you know whether our phenotype or what we look like essentially is related to our temperaments? And for example, like, are the men that are that their personality is more feminine, are they more feminine when it comes to their phenotype? So, for example, smaller, lighter, or is there no correlation there?
Yeah, that's a great question. I'm not fully sure about that. There certainly is some, homosexual guys that are effeminate, and they look more like girls and maybe have had less prenatal testosterone exposure. But there are also gay guys who look very masculine or so. So probably yes to some extent, but it's not a perfect indicator.
There is another question that I want to ask you that could be a little bit radioactive for some people, but my audience is quite robust like that. They can handle it.
Good. Right, good.
Sex differences in IQ distribution. So we know that men, essentially, they are more unevenly distributed. So we've got more men that are extremely intelligent and there are more men that are extremely unintelligent, whilst the distribution for women is more flat.
Mhm.
So what would drive that difference from the evolutionary biology perspective? Why would men benefit in the past from having that, the unequal, essentially, distribution of IQ?
Yeah, well, I mean, the guys at the lower end aren't benefiting at all. The question would be, what is it about the male brain that allows it greater variation depending on a variety of factors? Yeah, we don't know. I mean, the variation is there. There's more guys at the high end and at the low end, and more women in the middle. And the further out you go on the extremes, the bigger the ratios get. Yeah, I wrote a little bit about this in an article a few years ago. And it could be that the male brain is a little bit more, when it comes to the abstract problem solving and so forth, a little bit more vulnerable or sensitive to environmental factors, nutritional factors, health factors, and so forth. And so this plasticity or whatever might push guys toward, doing better if everything goes right. But that sensitivity to taking advantage of good conditions also creates poorer outcomes when things don't go right. So you kind of, when you increase the potential for something, it's like everything has to go right for it to get to that point. And the more complex and the longer, the brain development's longer in guys, the longer it takes, more complex it is, the more things that can go wrong, that's going to push it the other way.
That's fascinating, because I couldn't quite understand why evolution would come up with that. Because like you said, the guys that are on the lower end of distribution, and there is, on average, there is more of them than women. I mean, they are certainly not getting the good deal out of the evolution. So that would make sense. And I suppose that then hints to the sex differences in our development and the health outcomes. Right. And again, we've got plenty there. So women live longer, but they are prone to more neurotic, I suppose, personalities. And then men tend to be more emotionally stable, but I believe that men are more prone to heart attacks, for example, and to autism, for example. So would you then explain these health differences with the fact that men might be a little bit more vulnerable when it comes to optimal development?
Well, yeah, I've actually written a lot on this. I think the vulnerability depends on the trait. So for women, are more vulnerable in some areas, and men are more vulnerable in other areas. So one of the cognitive advantages that women have is episodic memory, which is memory for personal experiences. So you interact with somebody, and then women are better at kind of recalling the details of that interaction later on, or better at remembering the location of things, or whatever the case might be. The women's advantage on that increases as societies become healthier. So I mentioned that in healthy societies, men's height increases more rapidly than women's height. So you have more of a vulnerability for height for men, at least developmentally. You see the opposite for that for episodic memory. As conditions get better, as health gets better, and so forth, they fully develop this skill, and their advantage over men increases. Same with men's spatial abilities. As conditions get better, their spatial ability advantage increases.
Okay, so would you then say that like every single health outcome, for example, or health difference, so whether it's heart attacks, or whether it is like the rates of autism, there is plenty. We know that women are their immune systems are much more sensitive to pathogens, for example. So do we believe that essentially all of these are driven by slightly different things, but it's all developmental? Or is there parts of the evolutionary biology as well that sort of went into making sure that we are made like that? So I'm just trying to think whether, for example, men live shorter because they are bigger. So technically it would take more effort to keep the bigger system alive.
Right.
But then I suppose the elephants are a bit of the prove that my concept might not be quite right there.
Well, it's in species where males have a lot of competition amongst one another for females. So it's a lot of male competition. In mammals, we see a lot of that. The males are bigger than the females. Mm-hmm. Their immune systems aren't as well developed. They or don't react as robustly as the female immune system. The competition that they engage in results in a lot of wear and tear on the body, physically, but also physiologically. And in those species, males typically have shorter lifespans than females. And so men having shorter lifespans than women is part of a broader pattern associated with bigger, more aggressive, more competitive males having, the successful males doing really well, but there's a trade-off later in life, increased heart attacks, shorter lifespan, so forth.
Increased wear and tear essentially on all the necessary systems.
Right.
What was the one sort of single thing that surprised you the most when you started looking at the sex differences in health and development?
Yeah, the one thing I've been working on a lot is understanding the sex-specific vulnerabilities. So historically, it's been like, well, males are the vulnerable sex. So something goes wrong, you get higher mortality rates in males, which is true. But then you also get more males on the low end of cognitive ability and all of that. My argument is that anything where one sex has an advantage, whatever that trait is or constellation of traits, will be the most vulnerable. So women, for example, have the advantages in language that I mentioned previously.
Yeah.
And if we look at things like prenatal cocaine exposure, premature birth, not super premature, but like a month or two or so, that disrupts girls' language development much more severely than it does boys, because probably more resources are going into building those networks early prenatally and in the first few years of life in girls than in boys. If there's any disruption, these complex, kind of high energy, high demand systems are the first to get disrupted because they need more at that time. And we see something.
Go on.
Yeah, we see something similar with boys' spatial abilities with prenatal exposure, but also later problems.
It's fascinating that it seems to be that our seeing abilities are the ones that are being sacrificed first, not necessarily the basement skills
right.
as such.
Right. Yeah. It's just like you said, men are bigger. It takes more to keep the bodies going and developing appropriately and so forth. So men's physical size advantage also leads to a vulnerability. If there's nutritional deficits or long-term health deficits or whatever, it's going to affect men's height much more than women's height. But that same principle applies to language, memory, spatial abilities, a variety of other traits.
Okay, fascinating. Okay, so what is it that you're working on now, and what can people expect from your work over the next couple of years?
Yeah, so we have, we're working with a couple of colleagues looking at one study we didn't look at people, we looked at a lot of other mammal species and looking at variation amongst them. So in this case, we're looking at size. So some individuals, males or females, there's variation within the sex, which is important. And as I said, historically, it's been like, well, males are more variable. But what we find is that whichever sex is bigger is more variable. So in a lot of bat species, females are bigger than males because they have to carry their infants around while they're flying, which promotes size. But variation in female size there's more variation among female bats than male bats. And if we look at a related study, we looked at different types of cognitive skills, some of which there's no sex difference on, some of which boys do better on, like visual spatial sorts of things, some of which girls do better on. And whichever sex has the advantage is the more variable sex. So tasks that girls are better than boys on, you see wider differences among girls. And tasks that boys do better on, you see wider variances among boys. And our hypothesis is that, you get an advantage. The associated, talking about cognition, the associated brain network is probably more complex, which makes it more delicate. And if everything goes well, it's going to be really good. But because it's more complex and more delicate, if something goes wrong, it's going to really disproportionately affect that system.
Wow. That's fascinating.
So we're looking at that. We just submitted an article, large-scale study looking at sex differences in height as related to disease risk and developmental risks and so forth. And basically countries where there's low disease risk in very healthy populations, the differences are big. Males are bigger than women, men are bigger than women, and in really stressed populations, sometimes there's no sex difference in height. And we see the same thing as with historical data. So in Great Britain, men had about a 5 centimeter advantage over women, height-wise, in 1900. And by 1958, or people born in 1958, had gone up to 11 centimeters. So it's a huge change.
That's massive.
Yeah, it is a massive.
Wow.
It's obviously an environmental effect because you're not going to have evolution working that quickly. But what it says is that the evolved traits that give one sex or the other the advantage, the full expression of those traits is very dependent on health, current conditions, and developmental conditions. So to get if you have an evolved advantage, you don't really get that advantage unless everything goes right. We're looking at that, and then we want to take this. We can take the sex difference in height as a biomarker of the population's health. And so then we want to say, okay, countries where sex differences are biggest in height, are those also the same countries where men's advantage in visual spatial abilities is the biggest, and women's advantage in language or episodic memory sorts of things is the biggest? And if we're working on that, if we can show that, then it is a really good evidence, in my opinion, that the cognitive sex differences have a biological basis to them, but are also sensitive to environmental conditions, just like height is.
That is ultra fascinating. When can we expect to have some answers? When is that research due to be released? Do you know?
The mammal one where we submitted it to journal, it's being revised, and we'll submit it back. That was not as interesting. The height one we just submitted probably about a month ago. So if all goes well, hopefully by the end of this year. The other one, integrating the height stuff with the cognition stuff, is more complicated because it's harder to get the data. And so I think we have data where we can now look at it, but it'll take us a while to go through everything and see how it works. So maybe early next year, if all goes well. Maybe later this year. We'll see.
Lovely. And for the people that would like to stay sort of updated on the research that you're doing, where can they find you online?
Yeah, I don't actually do social media just because I'm busy. I did start a Substack thing, but I only have one article in it, which is a reprint of an article I wrote for Quillette on sex differences and brain and cognition and behavior and number of sexes and all of that. It's kind of a review thing for them. I've published a number of things in Quillette, and I have permission to add it to my Substack. So I'll do that eventually as I have time to do it. And also I have a website with my university that, lists things, or you can email me.
It lists all of your research, so I'll make sure that I'll link to that.
Okay.
David, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
You're welcome.
Ladies and gentlemen, I give you David Geary.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to Wisdom Rebellion. Before you go, if you enjoyed the conversation, please consider subscribing. It massively helps with keeping the show on the road so we can all build a wiser world together. And if you loved this video, you will also love this one. I'll see you there.